Good morning, everyone, and welcome to This Week with Dr. T, our weekly show on current events and topics. And with that, I want to introduce to you today our special guest, Mark Garreau, and I may have not said that right, and he can correct me, the author of The Needle Secret, The Bolus Theory Revolution. You don't want to miss what's coming because this is truly revolutionary. Welcome back, everybody. Mark Garreau is a visionary author, researcher, and strategic thought leader in health technology and innovation. His book, The Needle Secret, is a pioneering scientific investigation that reveals critical flaws in current vaccination and medical practices. He explains for the first time why vaccine injuries occur in some and not in others. He unveils how the accidental injection of vaccines directly into the bloodstream, the flaw of the injection protocol, is responsible for a wide range of serious diseases. This repeated mistake is likely the root cause of the explosion of modern illnesses such as cancer, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, autism, and many others. He also details effective therapeutic solutions, including stem cell simulation that could potentially heal millions of affected individuals. As a best-selling author, he has penned more than 100 articles and has earned BizNews Best of 2021 award. Residing in, he says he's in France, south of Paris now, but he's father of 4, is fluent in English, French, and Spanish. Mark, welcome to This Week with Dr. T, and please correct for me, the listeners, the appropriate way to say your last name.
Thanks for hosting me, Sherry. The name is Girardot. But don't worry about it. You know, I was born in the U.S. and I'm used to the difficulty of the R spelling. So thank you so much for hosting me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. You have a unique and diverse background that led to this discovery. Tell our listeners about your background and what led you to come to these conclusions.
My background is essentially business. I have an MBA from one of the leading schools in the world, and my entire career has been very much that of a generalist. During 10 years, I was the lead of Cisco's advisory team engaging with the automotive industry. One day, one of the CEOs here in Europe asked me to work with Big Pharma. So I had, about 15 years ago, had a first deep dive into pharma. But I'm essentially a consultant at heart, trained in the scientific method. And when COVID started, I had worked for one of the best companies right now that developed a universal anti-cancer therapeutic vaccine, a DNA vaccine. And I did a deep dive. I was trying to help them fund their phase 2. And I had to do a deep dive to understand the science. And that's when COVID hit. And I spent the last 5 years pro bono, spending most of my days to try to alert first on the fact that COVID wasn't that serious, or was mostly, for most people, was okay. But then I realized very early on that the vaccines were harmful. I saw it in the numbers, and I did the only root cause analysis, full-blown, that not only tried to acknowledge that there were accidents, but tried to understand why there was accidents and why was there so many different adverse reactions. And that's been my journey, and I've discovered the Bolus theory, which is fundamentally the fact that injections, not only of vaccines, of all injectables, are actually not intramuscular. They're not going through the route of the lymphatic system, but they're actually going randomly, directly into the vasculature. And that's a very big deal, because that means that those vaccines are systematically a Russian roulette. And the more you play Russian roulette, the higher the chances of being damaged. And that's basically what my whole theory is about.
Well, what is the Bolus theory? If you could take incredible work that you put together in this book, and there's charts and tables and graphs, and it just, you really, really define your theory and defend it. What is bolus theory in brief explanation?
It's been known for a century. Doctors a century ago knew that if you injected a vaccine, for example, with typhoid vaccine intravenously, you would have thrombosis. Okay. The bolus theory is the idea that when accidentally, invisibly, you're injecting directly a cytotoxic product, because a vaccine is a cytotoxic product, it's poison in low dose. When you inject it directly, what you do is you create a magnifying glass effect. So you send down the vascular system extremely high concentrated dose of vaccine, and it's going to do two things. It's going to touch two different Achilles heels of our bodies. One is the fact that it's going to carpet bomb the linings of our blood vessels, and it's going to trigger an immune reaction, which is going to strip entirely that lining called the endothelium. And that's going to trigger a number of imbalances, notably related to the coagulation cascade and all sorts of repair mechanisms, because we've never evolved to being harmed longitudinally. We're typically harmed cross-sectionally, if I may say. Like when you're cutting meats, you're cutting like that, and so the repair typically is fractal. But how do you repair something that's been damaged, like a million cuts on your vessel? It's going to prioritize some of it and deplete some of it, and that explains a lot of the imbalances that we're seeing. And there's another discovery. It took me a little more time, but it's massive. Is there are certain types of cells in our bodies that are, let's say, sacred, that are the sanctuary for our original genetic matrix. And those are stem cells. And the stem cells have one particularity, is that they're immune privileged. That means that if you contaminate them, they cannot scuttle themselves like other cells. And therefore, they need to find a solution to deal with that contamination. And what I've discovered is that when you contaminate stem cells, either with a virus, a bacteria, but also with a vaccine or potentially other injectables, you're going to trigger cancer and you're going to trigger genetic disorders. It's mechanistic, basically.
Well, you state that vaccine particles get injected directly into a leaky vascular system. That makes a lot of sense to me, because when it gets injected into the muscles, it immediately causes a vasodilated effect and causes damage to those little capillaries that are in the muscle. But can you briefly describe what happens when those particles get into the bloodstream, and then what happens next after they leak into the bloodstream?
Well, the first thing is when you insert the needle, you're going to cut through, as you were saying, you're going to cut through capillaries, but also sometimes venules and arterioles, sometimes fairly big ones. There's a cephalic vein that sometimes crosses there. So you can actually cut and sever these blood vessels. After that, you're going to inject at high pressure the vaccine. And by simple pressure differential, the vaccine is going to go directly into the vasculature. There's going to be two boluses, one direct, very big bolus, and the secondary bolus, because of the reaction of the muscle pressuring the liquid back into the system. And that's going to happen is during that first circulatory cycle. I'm going to get it. The exposure of the endothelium is going to be extreme, because the concentration at which you're delivering it at that moment is 300,000 times what it's supposed to be. Yeah. Okay, and so you're carpet bombing. You're going to do two things. You're going to carpet bomb the linings, right, in a varieties of taxonomies, different ways of landing. Sometimes it's going to be Jackson Pollock, sometimes it's going to be completely stripped, sometimes it's going to be sieve-like. But what it's going to do, it's going to tell the immune system to attack these cells. And the immune system is agnostic. It thinks it's a virus, it thinks it's the flu. It's going to destroy every single one of these cells that have been contaminated. And that's going to trigger coagulation, because the coagulation that we all know from bleeding is triggered by that last lining being destroyed. That's the first part. People need to imagine a cloud of particles going from the vein here to the right side of the heart, being pumped into the lungs, and then crossing those capillaries back to the left side of the heart, injected into the aorta, to the big arteries, and scattered and disseminated across the body. And while it does that, it's going to lose the coating, the protective coating it has, which is PEG coating, which forbids transfection. And so you have a sort of an activation mechanism as the journey advances. And if ever the activation is early, it's going to hit the capillaries in the lungs and create havoc there, or it's going to do damage the left chambers, the aorta, or wherever it's going to go. And after that, it's disseminated and it goes to the capillaries in the organs in the system, where it's going to do the same thing in a more disseminated way, but it's going to hit the capillaries in the organs. And there, the immune system is going to attack and also create imbalances. And the imbalances it creates are related to the repair mechanism. And so you have in the cardiovascular system, in the lungs, in the heart, in the aorta, in the large arteries, it's going to dictate thrombosis, thrombocytopenia. Thrombocytopenia, the fact is you don't have platelets. Why don't you have platelets? You don't have platelets because you've depleted them. The damage, the endothelium damage is so big that you've actually depleted the platelets. You are going to have calcifications because you've destroyed the lining and it hasn't been repaired fast enough, and the calcification inhibitors are gone. Those calcification plaques are going to be ripped off by the shear flow in certain areas, like the Willis circle or the aorta. And it's going to rip apart the second layer, the smooth muscle layer, and you're going to have aneurysms and you have dissections, and we've seen a lot of people having those. You're also going to have fistulas, because as you're demanding for angiogenesis, new vessel creation, if you're doing it in a longitudinal way, it's going to react at the entry points, so it's going to focus all the repair there. So we've seen also during those the COVID vaccines, we've seen a lot of fistulas, and also the famous white clots. And the famous white clots are actually, in my opinion, and I believe that's the only reasonable explanation, is you've actually destroyed the entire lining, so it's massive bolus, and coagulation has occurred. So it's actually a natural phenomenon that's created a tube, a clot in the form of a tube. Now the problem is, normally when we have a clot, our body sends a signal when it's repaired to dissolve it, within a week or so, or 2 weeks. But here, the signal cannot happen because that signal emerges from endothelial cells that are no longer present. And so what you end up with this long clot, which is supposed to be dissolved but isn't, and the immune system basically cleans it up, cleans everything that it can, all the red blood cells, the white blood cells, all the things that are alive, basically, that can take off, and it's going to leave that white fibrin there. The problem with those is that over time, just like calcification, they're going to start clogging, and that's why we're seeing some people having epilepsy crises or dying 3 or 4 years down the road because of the clotting. So that's the first part. The second part is really in the organs and the systems, where these immune attacks on the endothelium are doing two things. They're creating a thrombosis because there's an overwhelming demand for coagulation, and the coagulation inhibitors are overwhelmed, and so coagulation occurs, and that depletes the organs downstream from oxygen and nutrients. And it's going to kill totally or partially the organs and the systems. If it's in the heart, you're dead. If it's in the brain, you're dead. If it's in the pancreas, you're going to have type 1 diabetes, for example, because your beta cells have been destroyed. And then another element and a big part of my discovery, I didn't discover that, but I've conceptualized it, is the idea that the capillaries at the last bits in the tissue is typically the blood tissue barrier that filters everything that goes in the tissue and goes out of the tissue. Now, if you destroy that physically and you don't rebuild it properly, you're going to have a leaky capillary. You're going to break down an extremely sophisticated tool which is supposed to do that filtration and regulate whatever's coming out. And depending on the size of the leak, you're going to have inflammations, you're going to have IgEs, because you have material that from your blood that's entering it, and it's not supposed to be there. And if ever the leak is bigger, i.e. there's actually blood plasma going in, then it's going to be even worse. It's going to create new blood vessels, etc. It's going to create what people are talking aberrant angiogenesis and stuff like that. These leaky blood tissue barriers explain many of today's chronic illnesses. It explains autoimmune perfectly, which means that autoimmune is not really autoimmune. It's not the immune system that's wrong. It's the immune system that's reacting to something that's not supposed to occur, which is that barrier is gone. It's going to trigger also the release of material that's inside these organs. So if, for example, if it's an endocrine gland, it's going to release it, right? So, for example, last week, Recep Levi at the ACIP meeting talked about two adolescents who died day 3 and day 4 of a heart attack. And when you read the paper, they had contraction bands. And those contraction bands are typical of an epinephrine overdose. Wow. Well, how do you get an epinephrine overdose without an epinephrine shot? By releasing all the epinephrine that's in your adrenal glands, because you've destroyed that barrier. It explains these leaky blood tissue barriers, explains endocrine disorders, notably hypersecretion. It explains all neurodegenerative diseases, because those leaks with time are going to create degeneration. So it explains Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, MS, as well as Huntington disease. Explains endometriosis, where some cells behave like if they were endometrium cells, most likely because they're getting hormones, estrogen, progesterone, when they're not supposed to. It explains the fact that men have low sperm count, because if the blood testis barrier has been broken down, you're going to have T cells attacking sperm. So you're going to have very low immature sperm, and all the mature sperm is going to be gone. It's massive. It's really massive. So that's the part related to endothelium damage.
When I listen to you talk about this, and I think about a single COVID vaccine that sends tens of billions of cytotoxic particles through the vascular system, it also makes infants that get 7 injections on the same day. And the ACIP committee says, well, as long as you do it in separate limbs, it's okay if the whole body wasn't connected. So you can give 1 in each arm and 1 in each leg. And then now thinking about this bolus theory, about what you said about pushing it in quickly, because the nurses tend to do it as quickly as they can, thinking if they pull the needle out, the baby will stop crying, except they've just loaded up the entire vascular tree and gone into the brain with all these things. How do anybody survive that?
Well, thankfully, our bodies are amazing. One thing that people don't realize is that these boluses, these accidental injections, IV injections, happens 100% of the time. I started 4 years ago saying that, and people will tell me, no, Mark, it happens one time every 10,000 times. The reality of it is every single one of people who have been vaccinated, and we've been vaccinated too, it happens. And when it happens, in most cases, it's going to hit a little capillary here and there. It's going to be okay. But for example, there's two studies, Nakahara et al. And Burguin et al. That showed that all the people who were vaccinated had leaky heart capillaries. Okay, so that's a very big deal. But it's true that you probably have something like 5% chance of having something very severe and 1% chance of almost dying. So if you have 7 shots in one day, you almost have 25% chance of harming your kid, if I'm not wrong. I mean, I would need to do the calculation, but it's huge. It's crazy. Because of the Russian roulette effect, right? The more you try something, at one point, you're going to be damaged. In the book, I show that kids by 5 years old, I think they have 75% chance of being harmed and 24% chance of being severely harmed.
Wow. Tomorrow, at the time of this recording, tomorrow there's going to be a big announcement by the White House, by Secretary Kennedy at HHS, that they discovered the cause of autism. Some of the leaked documents I've seen, not a whisper about any of the 28 vaccines that kids get by the time they're 1 year of age. 28 doses of foreign matter that's why I no longer will talk about the pediatric vaccination schedule. I call it the pediatric poisoning program. It is. And now compound that poisons because so many chemicals and so much aluminum, fetal bovine serum, chicken parts, all these foreign proteins, is injecting into these little bitty babies. And everybody's ignoring it. It's like ignoring the elephant in the middle of the living room. Now, couple that with her concept of the bolus theory. How can this continue to be ignored?
I don't know. I've been talking about this for 4 years. I think this is even worse than Semmelweis. Okay, this is literally an accident, massive scale, and in the book, in the Needle Secrets, I explain that if we continue, society will collapse. You cannot continue like that. What is quite surprising to me is the cognitive dissonance that I met with, because the theory is mechanistic. It has nothing. There's no conjectures. There's one conjecture in the cancer side, but fundamentally most of it is dominoes that are mechanistic with scientific laws that dictate that. And I'd like to add to that there's 3 teams across the globe, one in Hong Kong, one in Munich, one in Korea, that have tested the bolus theory on animals. They've actually injected intravenously the vaccines, and guess what? Every single one of them found the exact same adverse reactions in the animals they've injected. So the bolus theory right now is the only theory that is reproducible. And it's not only reproducible with the COVID vaccines. Those were 3 COVID vaccines, but there are other, in the past, tests that were done with other vaccines intravenously, and every single time they produce these adverse reactions. So there's a complete consistency. It's actually basic physics. The bolus is a medical term to inject and direct particles at an organ in a concentrated fashion. Well, guess what? If you inject a cytotoxic product and you send a concentrated dose of those to an organ, you're going to harm that organ for sure.
Absolutely. Well, this is a great case that we're going to take a really short break. Today we're talking to Marc Giraudeau. I think I said that correctly this time. Um, uh, and I don't speak French, so I'm doing my best with Girdot. His book, which is easier to remember, is The Needle Secret and the Bolus Theory Revolution, because this is absolutely revolutionary. We're going to take a very short break here. There's so much more to come into discussion of this very important topic. We will be right back. Well, welcome back, everyone. Marc, you mentioned that you have been talking about this for 4 years and been met with some cognitive dissonance. Have you been able to get this theory into the hands of, say, Bobby Kennedy or Robert Malone or any of the people, let's say, on the ASIP committee? Anybody that could really look at this and value your premise and to take action on it?
Until now, it's very recent. I've had a discussion with 3 of Senator Johnson's team staff last week. They reached out to me. So I hope that's going to be the first domino to fall. I have been very vocal. I was on Steve Kirch's scientific committee for 2 years, and a number of the key players in the field were there. And very few of them have listened to me, sadly, even though, it has never been falsified, which is really interesting. But I think things are moving. I'm having a conversation with one of the ASIP member in 2 days. So my fingers crossed. This is really serious. All my friends have said, Marc, you're completely nuts. I've abandoned everything, including partly I've deprioritized my family because of what I've discovered, and I thought it was massive. And all my friends said, Marc, you're cuckoo, and I'm not. This is the most serious crisis in the history of the world.
Saying that you're cuckoo because of what you're doing, not because this cuckoo, because your premise is spot on. For what I've all of your research and the structure and the things that I've been able to read through a little bit of your book is that this will topple once and for all the vaccine industry, which in my opinion, I've been researching, talking about this, writing about this, advocating, warning about this as being a 200-year multi-generational myth of safe and effective. Really injecting foreign matter. And now you've documented the fact of what injecting this foreign matter, like cow blood and chicken fibroblasts and egg parts and Chinese hamster ovary cell, all these things into the body, of what that is actually doing. I would say, I would agree with your friends from the it may be dangerous, but so that may be the cuckoo part, but beyond the veil.
Yeah, what's interesting is the Bolus theory applies to vaccines, but it also applies to other injectables. You can have problems, even with saline, you can have problems with antibiotics, vitamins. Dentists know full well the risk of anesthetics in the mouth, and they have needles specialized to avoid that. And actually veterinarians know full well. It is amazing because the only case reports that I have found of vaccine accidents being caused by intravenous injections are in the veterinary space. Other than that, about a century ago, doctors knew perfectly well that an anaphylactic shock was not allergic. An anaphylactic shock was a direct hit into a vessel, and you were killing the person almost instantly. So it's also interesting because it's applicable to viruses and bacteria and even venom. If you get stung by a bee in the tissue, nothing will happen. It'll infuse very slowly into your body, and your body will be able to deal with it. But if that sting is actually in a blood vessel, it's going to go directly to your lungs and kill you. So there's a huge consistency. It's a unifying theory of medicine in a way.
Well, we've got about 15 minutes left in our time here together. Let's talk about the repairability and the body's resiliency for this.
Okay. It's very clear that thankfully the children are loaded with stem cells, and a lot of these accidents are actually being repaired on the fly. So of course that's the beauty of it, but it's crazy. Actually, everybody's being damaged, and it's because of our capacity of repair that the damage are not as bad as they could be. So that's the first point. There are a number of ways you can repair. The body is going to be able to repair some of it. Most of the necrosis is very difficult to repair, but some of it is. And after that, there's a real issue with sensitivity. You know, there's some areas where where I agree with you is that, you know, it's not only about a huge dose going haywire. It can be a very small dose hitting the wrong area, and you'll bleed to death, right? So, that's really the main issue. Now, I guess you want me to talk about therapeutics now. Yeah, I think that's what you're aiming to. So let me tell you what I've discovered, and there's some limitations I'm discovering, but it's fascinating. If you look at nature, how nature repairs when you have problems like these, what nature does is coagulates to avoid bleeding, right? Or to avoid having leaks into the tissue, etc. And then it repairs the tissue, it revascularizes, it repairs the linings, etc. And then after that, it dissolves the white clots or the clots. So what we need to do is go back to that sequence. We don't need to coagulate more, thankfully, but what we need to do is repair. And the way you do that is by stimulating stem cells, because whatever the allopathic medicine says, the only thing that could repair your tissue is your own stem cells. So whichever path you go, you need to push on my own stem cells is going to repair me. And that can be done in a variety of ways. What is interesting is you realize that humans had already cracked that code, or a lot of it. And, you know, it's often about mimicking aggression to your body, but not acting upon that aggression. So basically, you trick your stem cells into thinking that you're about to go through a desert, and the heat will require stem cells to compensate for the damage of the heat. Right. So, for example, that's why saunas are so good, or that's why going in having a cold bath is so good for you. Because every time what you do is you simulate nature being aggressive to you, and your body prepares a defense. And so there's a variety of ways: red light therapies, sanatoriums, of course, oxygen therapy, which is my favorite, because oxygen therapy is extremely safe and it's systemic. So it's going to trigger all the stem cells in your body.
When you talk about oxygen therapy, you're referring to hyperbaric oxygen or other types of therapy, oxygen therapy?
They all work. They all work. The only work that has some degree of literature is hyperbaric oxygen therapy, because there's a little money, and it's authorized by the FDA, notably to revascularize tissue that's been necrotized by radiotherapy. So it's not the pressure that's stimulating stem cells. It's the hyperoxygenation. And so hyperbaric oxygen therapy is great, but it's expensive, it's impractical. Sometimes it hurts the ears. So I've moved from that in the past year, because very few people could afford it, especially in the US. The prices are absolutely impossible. And a lot of people have been using just oxygen concentrators, which do the same thing. It's slower, but it's safer, and it's more progressive. And I've had some of my readers try it out on their own and coming back to me, both with hyperbaric oxygen therapy and normal baric, with amazing results. I mean, there's a gentleman in New Zealand who had a stroke, who had brain fog, who had alopecia, who had POTS, who had skin disorders, he had COVID toes, I don't know what else he had. He was miserable for 3 years, read my book, bought an oxygen tent, a hyperbaric oxygen tent, and 10 days later called me up and said, Mark, I've tested all the protocols. What I read in your book actually did more for me in 10 days than anything else. And he continued doing 150 hours, and women were touching his skin and say, hey, you have a baby skin. He basically rejuvenated completely. What was interesting with that experience was POTS had not disappeared. And so I went to my theory, my framework, and he told me I did 150 hours. Normally 150 hours of hyperbaric oxygen therapy would mostly cure everything, rebuild everything. And so we had a little conversation. We were trying to do scientific work together. And at one point it hit me because the only part really in my theory which is not addressable by oxygen therapy is the last bit of the repair, which is the dissolution of the clots. So we had this conversation. It was fascinating because I said, well, but hold on a second. If you have white clots in your arteries, in your leg arteries, whenever you're going to stand up, your arteries are not going to be able to constrict, and you're going to faint, or you're going to have problems. You're going to have tachycardia because your heart is going to try and compensate for that. So he went on. He read some literature. I provided him with some of it on nattokinase and fibrinolytics. And same thing, 10 days later, said, Mark, I've improved my postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome by 90%.
Wow, that's fantastic. There's other hypotheses of vascular injury and injury with the circulating spike protein theory. What is the persistence of spike proteins, and how does that play into the bolus theory?
Okay, so I've been a very strong opponent of that, vocal, for very basic reasons. We have, the spike protein is a protein, it's a foreign antigen, and we have an immune system that works really well. And the quantities of spike protein are minuscule. Even the maximum that was found is after 5 days after the first injection. Actually, after the second injection, there's hardly any spike protein because the T cells react very quickly and they kill production in the egg. But here, 150 picograms per ml corresponds to, I think, 480 million spike proteins per ml. Now, the problem is there is, I think, 840 trillion natural antibodies that they're faced with. So basically you have one spike protein for 1.5 million natural antibodies, which are playing tag football basically with the spike protein. So the spike protein is neutralized and cannot be the root cause. It is a sign because, of course, the T cells are attacking cells that are producing spike, right? That's the mechanism of action of the vaccine. But the spike protein, there's multiple ways you can falsify it. Antibodies, which is mathematical, it's overwhelming. There's also the wound topology. So the wound you see in the autopsies are often in the arteries. They're always T-cell related, and they're also in foci, which just means that they're concentrated. Now, proteins don't aggregate in the aorta. Okay, they aggregate in tissue maybe, but they don't aggregate in the aorta. That's impossible. So the circulating spike protein is a fake. Unfortunately, everybody's been talking about it. The persistence of spike is real, but I haven't seen proofs that it's actually being through production. So a lot of people are saying our bodies are continuing to produce spike. My hypothesis is different, is we are storing spike. And where do we store spike? We store spikes in huge quantities in the white clots. And so, of course, and that's been proven, right? During the coagulation cascade, the platelets take everything with them, right? And they're going to take huge amount of spike. And those spike are going to be released in the process of hollowing out the white clots that I was describing earlier. So that's why people have high titers of antibodies against spike, in my opinion. There's much more proof from that. And then some people are taking IVIGs, and they are also taking monoclonal antibodies that are supposed to neutralize spike proteins. But if you don't have spike, well, your body will produce spike-like antibodies that are going to neutralize what you're injecting yourselves. Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't know if it's clear, but we're basically telling our body to create spike antibodies, or spike-like antibodies, but that's not spike, that's completely different.
Well, this is such an important topic, Mark. We may have you come back and go into more detail about this because there's so much to be said about this. And I feel like we've given a great overview, but there's so much more to be said. So with that, where can people get your book? And I think that you have a Substack where you post articles. Where can people find both of those?
Okay, people can find the book on Amazon. I'm self-published. And I have a Substack called the Bolus Theory series, where there's a lot of material. I go deeper on many different topics. My last topic was actually on in utero boluses. So how can the bolus actually get to the baby? And there's actually a lot of signs that it can happen. It's not going to happen all the time, but there's a possibility that you would send a bolus into the baby and create autism to a baby who will never get vaccinated.
Mhm. Well, like I said, we've got more to talk about. I want to thank you so much for this first. I'm serious about, I'm going to have Michelle schedule you to come back to go into more detail about this because this is information that is not widely known and needs to be. So today, I want to thank you so much for the initial introduction to this. I want to close out with one of my favorite verses from the Bible. I close all my podcasts with, whether it is live or pre-recorded, which is Romans 12:12. Rejoice in hope, be patient in trouble, and be persistent in prayer. So until the next time we get together, lean into God, trust Him for everything.